Hello, Vermonters. My name is Zachary Hampl. I'm a 31-year-old resident of Rutland County. Like so many Vermonters, I do in fact believe that our state is heading in the wrong direction from a financial perspective. And the fact that our state's budgetary needs have not been satisfied is in fact a reflection of that. Over the last number of weeks, I've conversed with a number of different registered voters. Voters that are registered Republicans, registered Democrats, progressives, libertarians, moderates, independents, and all different kinds of political affiliations. Based on my interactions with all of these registered voters, they've fundamentally contributed to one overbearing consensus, and that is that the so-called two-party system is not working in the favor of Vermonters. I am fully inclined to agree with them because, to tell you the truth, I've been watching this now for years and years, and there were so many different things that came over the last 9 years, ever since 2016, that I thought our state could do much better, and I thought that there were a number of areas where our state could improve, not only meeting its fiscal strength, but also addressing the solvency of our state, and unfortunately, I have not seen that actually happen. I've been silent about these issues for as long as I possibly can. The truth is that when it came to the issues of Act 73, specifically as it relates to education reform and our state not having the ability to responsibly finance education reform, housing, healthcare, which I do believe, by the way, should be treated and recognized as a human right. Act 73 for me was the straw that broke the camel's back. And at that point, I said to myself, enough is enough. I cannot continue to be silent about these issues any longer. And so I have decided to throw my hat into the ring to not only address our state's budgetary needs, which, of course, in my estimation, are completely out of balance in a number of different regards. I've decided to boldly, dare I say, challenge the so-called establishment of a so-called two-party system, because it seems to me that under the weight of Republican versus Democrats and the vice versa, our political divisiveness has contributed to our state not only moving in the wrong direction financially, but also from a humanitarian standpoint as well. And that is exactly the reason why I've decided to run for the Treasurer's office as a third-party candidate. Now, I'll be very, very honest with you and say that it is true that I am actually running as a progressive. However, I want it understood that I'm probably not your so-called average progressive, because for the last 8.5 years, I have identified myself historically as a libertarian conservative. And I decided that in terms of if we're going to be serious about meeting our state's budgetary needs and being able to champion teamwork, and if I'm going to be serious about throwing my hat into the ring, I have to step way outside of my comfort zone. And in order to do that, to run for office, which I've never done before, is one thing. But to also run on a party that I do not ordinarily identify myself with is also to put myself outside my comfort zone even further. And what I was amazed to find out was that, for the most part, registered Republicans, registered Libertarians, and registered Progressives do, in fact, have more in common than I originally gave all three of those parties credit for. And that is exactly the reason why I believe, as a third-party candidate for the Treasurer's office, there's no better party that I can think of to run on than, in fact, as a third-party candidate, in this case progressive, for the Treasurer's office, because the Treasurer's office is completely apolitical. Let me just be absolutely clear about that. It is not a policy-making position. It is purely finance, but that's only half the battle. The other half of the battle is working with human beings, because it's really, really important to remember that all members of the legislature, who do in fact have the authority to appropriate funds for where the investments within our state ought to be made, they are human beings as well. And not just any human beings, they're also Vermonters. And so this is one of the reasons why I've decided to simply say that with all my conversations that I've had with a number of registered voters, quite frankly, the two-party system is not working. I'm sick and tired of it. A lot of voters in the state of Vermont are sick and tired of it. And to tell you the truth, I really don't blame them. Because in a nutshell, just to talk about our budgetary needs for our state, One thing that I do believe that all voters, at least ones that I've conversed with over the past 3.5 weeks, closer to a month, is that the value of the dollar has gone through the floor and the cost of living has gone through the ceiling. So the question is, whose fault is that? Well, the Republicans won't take any responsibility for it because they're always claiming that they want lower taxes. The Democrats won't take any responsibility for that because they're claiming that the Republicans are allegedly allocating tax loopholes to the so-called super wealthy or 1%. So neither side is seeming to take responsibility for the value of the dollar going through the floor while the cost of living going through the ceiling. And so the question becomes, whose responsibility is that? Well, somewhere out there, I guess there's an extraterrestrial that's doing this to us, I guess, and that does need to be addressed. So what I essentially have prepared here for you today is a model, it's an example, about ways that I believe personally, and I certainly hope that you would agree with me on this one, in ways that our state can make better investments. Not just any kind of investments, but investments for the benefit of all Vermonters. It really began in a couple of years ago when I was first introduced working as an account executive. And I was using arbitrage and free trade to accumulate for the organization that I was working for a 6,125% or 6,250% ROI within 8 short weeks. And when I came back to the state of Vermont, I do believe that there is a way to be able to capitalize on the models or the examples, the premises that I was working in as an account executive in Tinsboro, Massachusetts, and then have those kinds of examples, those models, become more applicable to public service to be able to benefit Vermonters. And that's why I'm here today. So one of the things that I've heard candidates for the Treasurer's Office talk in great detail about are a couple of different things. One are bonds and bond ratings, and the other are what are known as projections. Now, me personally, I really do wish that they wouldn't call them projections, but rather I wish they would call them estimations, because estimations are much, much more in synchronization with anticipated investment income, or even ROIs for that matter, that are not 100% guaranteed. But fundamentally, however you choose to look at it, it's my understanding that projections and estimations are relatively the same thing. So for the longest time, bond ratings was at the top of my mind. Our state does, in fact, appear to have an incredibly high bond rating. Now, let's just be absolutely clear about what a bond is. The best way to think about a bond is that it's essentially a loan. It's just a loan. That's all it is. There are so many different kinds of bonds. Bonds come in all different shapes and sizes. There's a treasury bond, there are municipal bonds, there are all different kinds of bonds that the Treasurer's Office can be issued. The way that it really works in terms of the Treasurer's Office issuing those bonds is that it begins with what is known as the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee. Now, what that committee does is they make recommendations, and a lot of times those recommendations are made on what's known as tax-supported debt, and those recommendations get submitted over to the governor's office, and then from the governor's office, they then go to the legislature. And at that particular point in time, and I do want to get for the record, by the way, that the governor's office and the legislature, they can decide what kind of projects that they would like to focus on that they believe that they deem are the most creditworthy. And the reason that they can choose to abide by them or that they can choose to disregard them is because of the fact that our government is a democracy. It is not a monarchy, it's not a dictatorship, and it's not supposed to be a government that is filled with oligarchs. And financial fascism, in my estimation, and I would hope you'd agree with me on this one, has absolutely no place in public service. After the recommendations are decided upon, the legislature ultimately has the power to be able to make those decisions for those recommendations. That is when the Treasurer's Office issues the bonds. So there are, like I said, there are different kinds of bonds, but then there are even more specifics to different kinds of bonds than that. So currently, as I mentioned, our state appears to have a very, very high bond rating. Now, I just want to focus on high bond ratings instead of low bond ratings. High bond ratings, the reason why they are called high bond ratings is because of the fact that they are incredibly stable. So what that means is that the higher the bond rating is, then usually, for the most part, the lower the yield is for the bonds, okay? That is the most important thing to focus on as far as bond ratings are concerned. I do realize that there are many, many more specifics that are associated with that, but I'm trying to keep this as simply as I possibly can, so that way it does address, in fact, the issues of financial literacy from a transparency standpoint, which I also do believe is another major issue that our state does need to focus on to make sure that our state's budgetary needs can be met. And not just be met, but also be met responsibly, because there are different ways about going financially in terms of the world of finance. There are different ways to invest responsibly and invest recklessly. And that's where the Treasurer's Office comes in as far as working with the legislature is concerned. So what I have over here is actually an example about how bond ratings ultimately work. And I'm going to try to go through this as succinctly as I possibly can to help you understand. So like I said, there are what are known as estimations or projections. And I was wondering for the longest time if whether or not estimations and projections could be relatively similar or compared to bond ratings. And I really wrestled with that for quite some time, and what I came to find out was that the answer was not only yes, but it does in fact offer a solution to ways that bond ratings or the interest on those bond ratings can be used for other investment opportunities. So looking at the chart from here, this video is being recorded in the month of May of 2026, and this screenshot was actually taken based on a simulator that some friends of mine and I put together, which is actually matched off of a 401k. And what we did was we took a lump sum of cash that was artificially generated, and we essentially purchased a number of different treasury bonds. Treasury bonds that had a proven track record to be very, very stable and also have incredibly high ratings. So the most important thing that you'll notice is that all of these all these estimations that are listed through here, these estimations are relatively equal. And that is one of the most important things to keep in mind, which again, just so this record is clear, that's one of the reasons I'm running as a progressive, because of the fact that for the most part, progressives talk about equality over and over again. And what I'm really trying to show is that there is a way to be able to have equality in a financial standpoint, which is just about as political as I would like to make this presentation. So each of these estimations is on a month-by-month basis. You'll notice that all of these estimations, which are entirely based on bonds that were purchased via simulation, are relatively equal. And when you look over here on the far side over here, you'll notice that they are just barely shy of about $55. I don't know if you can see it on screen or not. Down here, one of the things you'll notice is that this here, everything in light blue is EST, that stands for estimation. And unfortunately, for this chart's purposes, it actually says the word dividends. Now, to be absolutely clear, dividends and interest rates are very, very similar. However, they are in fact different. The reason that they are different is because of the fact that for the most part, and again, just to keep things as simply as I possibly can, dividends come from shareholdings or common stock. And common stock, or in other words, whatever might be available for public trade in the S&P 500 is very, very volatile. And bonds are much more stable. They're not as volatile as common stocks. And so, unfortunately, this chart, just to be as transparent as possible, the best that we could come up with were dividends, but what I really wish is that this would say EST or estimation interest. And then it goes on to say remaining, so that accounts for all of the months from May of 2026 over to April of 2027, and that is full 12 months. And then up here, you'll notice that the estimated income for what these really are, which are bonds, is $640.13. Monthly average, once again, $53.34. And then it goes on to list the estimated remaining amount and the interest remaining, because of the fact that these are all projections or estimations that are going on to the future. And this, of course, says over the next 12 months. Okay, so we've got this, I think. I think we've got this pretty much down cold. That all of the things, all of these estimations you're seeing from the bond ratings, these are in synchronization as close as we could get them to be relatively equal. So the problem with this chart, however, is that it only shows May of 2026. It does not show January and all the way through of 2026, and that's because we could only get so much information inside of one screenshot. So that's where the next chart comes in. Okay. This next chart right here, at first glance, I think you can at the very least, is immediately notice a difference. What this is a combination of estimations that are based on the ratings of the bonds that have yet to be paid from the month of May of 2026 all the way to December of 2026. But then you come over here from January to April, and what you'll notice is that the ROI, because down here you'll notice in darker blue it says received dividends, but for bond purposes, what it really should say is received interest. But unfortunately, for the simulation purposes, this was just about as close as we could get it. So the question becomes, how in the world did these ROIs get this high when the estimations were only this much altogether? And if you'll notice, actually, the return on investments were considerably, in fact, almost double for the month of January, that it actually increased the monthly average just to balance out the rest of what we have right here. So, first of all, for January of 2026, what we did in the simulation was we took the estimation for the bond rating that we were ultimately projecting or estimating to have received, so imagine that this square over here that you're seeing, it was actually over here, and this was in 2026 in the month of January. And then by the end of January, you'll notice that the ROI was triple. Just about triple. So how can this possibly be? What we did was we took the interest rates that we did receive at the very beginning of the month from the bond ratings, and then we worked together as a team to explore other investment opportunities. So with that in mind, it's the same kind of process as simply saying, if this is truly all the amount that we were expecting to receive, $53.34 is what we're receiving, and then let's go ahead and explore different investment opportunities, we were able to do that. We had all kinds of leverage to be able to do that. So January of 2026, we are off to a great start. The ROI is really, really high. And then, of course, we come over here to the month of February of 2026, and you'll notice that the ROI is actually just a little bit smaller. It's still considerably higher than what was estimated, but it's actually less than the month of January. So why in the world did this happen? We're going to come back to this in just a few moments because there's something else that I want to point out before we go to the next chart. So over here for the month of March, we're going back up. We're higher than January, and then here we are at April, and you'll see that there's just a little bit of remaining investment income that is based on the bonds themselves, which matches the color over here that is still to be anticipated coming in. So now that we know for a fact that we're doing something right because the ROIs are going up for investment opportunities, what about February? Something is going down. So something happened here. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. Okay, now I think you can see this chart much, much better. I apologize to say that we don't actually have the numbers over here on this side of the chart, and that's because when we screenshotted this particular portion and we had to zoom in. Unfortunately, there was so much information over here that got left out. But believe it or not, this total return on investment actually amounted to over $224 by the end of April. So back over here to the month of February. So like I said, January, we're off to a great start. And this dark blue up here is actually interest that was received on top of, and actually I'll go back to it. Let's see, where is it here? Received interest, so you can actually receive interest on interest. So imagine that the received dividends that you're seeing right here, replace this word here, dividends, with interest, and what have you got? You've got received interest, which is actually being made on received interest. In other words, an investment that not only pays for itself, but you're making interest on the interest. What a concept. I can't believe that our treasurer has not worked with the legislature to be able to do that. And that's why I'm running for this office, because my hope is to be able to change that in terms of working with the legislature. So I keep going all around it, and I apologize. I don't have a script, so try to bear with me anyways. So for the month of February. So like I said, January's off to a great start, but February, not so good. So what this data tells us is that we did something wrong. There might have been some kind of detail that we might have missed over here in the month of January that we didn't foresee coming in the month of February, or there may have been a miscommunication. And usually miscommunications result in misunderstandings. And no wonder our two-party system is not working. Because guess what happens to these ROIs when the communication isn't balanced? Yep, you guessed it. The budget also goes out of balance in a number of different areas, but so do the return on investments. These also these also are not going to match what we originally had for the month of January. So this data gave us an opportunity to really examine, to really hone in on what we did right in the month of January and what we did wrong in the month of February. And then we're able to go back through those records, through those financial records, and be able to make corrections so as to introduce a solution to say, let's see what we can do to work together as a team to set aside our political differences, for example, so that way we can have even higher ROIs by the month of March. Well, sure enough, for the month of March, you'll notice that it's not only that the ROI is not only higher than the month of February, it's also higher than the month of January's. Okay, so we did something really, really correctly. Now let's see if we can champion that to have even better success for the month of April. And what you'll notice is that the month of April is actually the highest ROI that we have achieved thus far. Unfortunately, what I don't have is a screenshot with me, for time purposes that is, that shows what we've accumulated so far for the month of May, nor do we have the data in for all of these remaining months here, and in terms of being able to present that here on this broadcast. But we do expect to have all of this data completed by the end of December of 2026. So we're going to get this chart out of the way here. Okay, now why am I, there we go. So why in the world would I bring this to the attention of the voters? Well, I bring this to the attention of the voters for a very, very specific reason. The Treasurer's Office does not actually authorize investments to be made. That power rests with the legislature. The legislature ultimately has the authority to direct the Treasurer's Office as to where those investments should be made. However, it is critically important to remember that the Treasurer's Office should be a team player. In other words, promote the power of teamwork with the legislature, so that way they can set aside their political differences and concentrate on what they have in common. So what really ends up happening is when you give the legislature estimations that are really, really high, that opens the door for the legislature to concentrate more on political divisiveness, and quite frankly, that's not fair to the legislature. It's also not fair to Vermonters. When you give them estimations that are considerably smaller, it says to the legislature, it really puts the pressure on all members of the legislature to say, oh my goodness gracious, if for estimation purposes, if this is all that we have to work with, then we had better concentrate on teamwork and find common ground. So in my estimation, no pun intended, because we are talking about estimations and projections, but in my estimation, that's one possible way that I do believe can help our legislature get back on track towards doing the right thing for Vermonters. So the question really becomes at that point, seeing as how we have these staggeringly high ROIs, what exactly were these investment opportunities? Well, unfortunately, I won't have enough time to cover all those investment opportunities, but in a nutshell, healthcare and housing, which I do in fact believe should be treated as a human right. And that's one of the reasons why I decided not to run as a Republican, because according to the Republican Party's establishment, I guess that's not Republican enough. But I also have yet to receive, and I don't believe that I actually will receive, the endorsement from the Progressive Party either, because apparently I'm not progressive enough. So I guess that counts for falling somewhere right in the middle in terms of being able to find common ground with all sides of the aisle. And again, that's just about as political as I can be. So just to review, this is all about bonds and bond ratings, projections, and estimations. Now, the question becomes, with the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee that I talked about just a bit earlier, tax-supported debt. Okay, let me go ahead and see if I can readjust this here. There we go. Okay, so this is another simulation that we have. Now, what you'll notice immediately is that we have what's known as a net debit. We have the margin market value. So the net debit over here, again, taxpayer-supported debt, simulation-wise, amounted to negative $13,271.89. Margin market value was $29,648.78. So what that essentially means is that once this debt is totally paid down, this is actually what the total account's value will actually be. And it goes even further to tell you what the margin interest that was accrued on a daily basis is concerned, which is only $4.26, which, and then it gives you the actual margin interest rate of 11.825%. And then this also tells you what the net house surplus is at just around $400, the net SMA at just a little over $10,500, and the margin interest accrued rate. And I'm not going to bore you to tears with all the technical jargon. The point is that I do want to make specifically is that the net debit is the total factors in the total amount of debt that you have to work with, and that's essentially where the taxes come into play. So a lot of times we hear about raise taxes on the wealthy. Well, this is why I haven't received the endorsement from the Progressive Party, I don't believe, is because I'm not entirely in favor of raising the taxes on the so-called super wealthy, because what that ultimately does is it chases out potential investors for the state of Vermont. And it also scares away homeowners, and that doesn't do our demographics any favors. And again, that also contributes to higher costs of living while the value of the dollar goes through the floor. So we've got to make sure that we're going to be able to fix that, and that's one of the reasons why I put this chart together. So how exactly does this look in relations to what we talked about earlier with regards to the estimations and projections that are totally based on bond ratings? Fortunately, our secondary simulation was able to produce this. Okay. So we've already established that we know for a fact that the total net debit based on the simulation is just a little over $13,000. But when you look over here, this right here is the actual income that you're seeing, which is just like what we talked about with those projections and those bond ratings. But what you'll notice, the difference between this chart and this one here is that there is something that's actually underneath the actual ROI as far as income was concerned. Well, when they talk about tax-supported debt, this is essentially, not specifically, but it's essentially what they're getting at. When I say they, I mean the legislature and other candidates who have run for this office in the past. So we know for a fact that we do have some net-supported debt here, but you'll notice that the ROI is actually considerably higher than the actual debt. And that means that the ROI is actually paying down the debt in this particular case for this time period right here. For this time period over here, you'll see that the debt's just a little bit larger. However, the ROI is considerably higher. And because of the fact this screenshot was taken in the month of April, this data has yet to be determined, but what we are forecasting, what we're estimating is that this right here will actually, this ROI will be considerably higher than this ROI. This debt may be possibly just a little bit larger than this one here, but we don't necessarily suspect that to be the case because now we can essentially allow for the investment income to pay down the debt itself. So therefore, we don't have to do any more borrowing. But this is only for investment income on a yearly basis. Here's what it looks like on a monthly basis. Now you'll notice that in a lot of cases, the debt that you're seeing that's underneath the ROIs that are here for these investment incomes, yes indeed, it is considerably lower, and the ROI was not as high as originally forecasted. But again, that's because when we were putting the simulation together, what we realized was we wanted to be as close as we possibly could to the legislature in terms of recognizing that we are only human beings and not robots. So we're not going to get it right every single time. And that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind because, again, we're talking about working with human beings. It's one thing to be able to look at the Treasurer's Office purely from a textbook standpoint in terms of economics and credit ratings and so forth. It's another thing to be able to harness the power of teamwork to talk with these people so that way they can work together to make sensible decisions as far as investments are concerned for the state of Vermont to benefit Vermonters, which is one of the reasons why I wish I had more time to talk about real estate investment trusts, because I can think of no better way to be able to treat housing as a human right than that. I hope to cover that in another video, by the way. Okay, so let's go back over here. And this next slide is really, really important because this shows how tax-supported debt is in fact truly supported based on what the taxpayers can afford. So over here, what you'll have in darker blue is these are actually the balances. And you'll notice actually, the reason that this is balances here is because in this chart here, you'll see that balances are actually highlighted in blue, and then over here, income is highlighted in blue. So once again, the computer got it wrong in terms of taking these screenshots. Don't know if you can see that actually. There we go. So the screenshot actually got it wrong in terms of color corrections, and that's another thing about transparency as far as financial literacy is concerned. You shouldn't have to be an economist to understand this. Excuse me. But you should be able to look at it and be able to understand it. So let's cut to the chase. Over here, you'll notice that the balances for what was invested for this specific period dropped significantly. However, it made contact with the underlying debt support by the taxes and so forth. As soon as it came down and it hit right here, and when I say it hit, what I do mean are the balances. When the balances came down and hit the debt, it immediately bounced back up. And then it essentially began to level off. So the question becomes, did this right here, as in the net debit, or in other words, the tax-supported debt, did this part right here do its job? You better believe it did. It did its job very, very well. And I submit actually that even though you can see that, that the debt has actually gone up considerably higher, when the balances went down, so did the debt in part. When the balances ultimately reached the threshold here for what was being supported by the debt, the balances bounced back up. So the balances actually are higher than the debt. So that is critically important to understand that when they talk about tax-supported debt, this is essentially just a model. Again, this is not a perfect example, but this is just a model to help explain what they're talking about by tax-supported debt, and to make sure that, because we wanted to put it to the ultimate test, and that's why we did the simulation this way, was because we wanted to make sure that if it's going to be truly tax-supported debt, we've got to make sure that what the taxpayers can afford is going to be able to support it. Okay. So that was a lot of information. I understand that not everyone out there is an economist, Guess what? I don't have a degree in economics myself. What I do have a degree in, however, is social sciences. But I do have experience in financial services in terms of making investments. So with the couple of minutes that I have left, the one ultimate primary investment that I do believe that the state of Vermont can benefit from significantly is what is known as a collaborative banking system. Because ultimately, when it comes to the world of finance and when it comes to working with human beings, especially since we're talking about members of the legislature, to be able to benefit not just a select few of Vermonters, but all Vermonters, we've got to have the power of teamwork ready to rock and roll. And in this particular case, to combine finances with human beings, it's going to take a lot more than just mere teamwork. It's going to take collaborations, and it's going to take coalitions. And why stop there? Why not have a collaboration that is so strong that it results in the formation of a collaborative banking system? It's really important to understand that a collaborative banking system is not necessarily to be confused with either a partnership bank or a state bank. However, they are synonymous with each other at many levels. And as a matter of fact, I submit actually that collaborative banking systems, more likely than not, have the potential to have the best of both worlds. State banks excel at retaining capital gains within the state borders. That's a fantastic thing, except as far as the Libertarian Party is concerned, and I fully inclined to understand what their concerns are, that could in turn have a negative effect in terms of giving more power to the state and thereby increase the size of the government. And as we all know from President Ronald Reagan, as government expands, our liberties contract. Partnership banks are essentially exactly what they sound like, first of all. They do, in fact, have the power of partnership. They generate revenue internally. And the reason that they do this is because there's what's known as SRM, which stands for Strategic Risk Management. Unfortunately, SRM offers more financial benefits than you can begin to shake a stick at. Even I don't understand SRM inside and out as well as I probably should. But what I do know for certainty is that when it comes to harnessing the power of SRM, it's very, very, very impressive in terms of having enough financial defense to have the synergy of compounded interest be generated both internally and sometimes externally. And that's essentially how partnership banks work. But even then, in some cases, it is true that partnership banks do not necessarily guarantee that that retains the capital gains within the state borders. So the question becomes, how can we have the best of both worlds? A banking system that retains the capital gains within the state borders, but also has the power of partnership as well. That is where a collaborative banking system comes in. This is exactly the reason why I'm running for the treasurer of the state of Vermont. I do believe, as I've mentioned, beyond a reasonable doubt, that healthcare and housing and even education reform, all of these things should be responsibly financed. They absolutely should be. As far as housing is concerned, I believe it's a human right. As far as healthcare is concerned, I also believe that that is a human right as well. I tell you this because there's a difference between constitutional rights, such as the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, every single one of our Bill of Rights, and human rights. Constitutional rights are written in stone. Human rights, now there is a completely different area that comes from a more human beings standpoint. And sometimes registered Republicans will say, well, how can you justify that human rights such as housing and health care can be financed for our people? And where in the world do you get your justification for that as far as our country is concerned? Well, the answer is actually in the Declaration of Independence, that we have a right to life. As far as the Republicans are concerned, life begins at the moment of conception, but they seem to care about life from the moment of conception until the moment of birth. What about after the child is born? Well, that becomes very expensive. Well, it doesn't have to be that way, because we can, in fact, harness the power of synergy compounded interest via a collaborative banking system to make sure that all of those different programs in terms of reforms are in fact financed responsibly. And this is why I'm running as a progressive. Like I said before, and I'll say it again, I have yet to receive the Progressive Party's endorsement. That's good news for Republicans, I suppose, because as far as the progressives are concerned, I guess I'm not progressive enough. As far as the Republicans are concerned, I guess I'm not as Republican as liberals might believe, because of the fact I believe that housing and health care should be treated as human rights, with the stipulation that the solvency of the state is addressed first. Like I said, that was a lot of information. I want to thank you, however, so much for the courtesy of your time. Over the course of the campaign, I'll leave you with this. I'm going to be campaigning relatively aggressively, progressively, to make progress, to emphasize that during this election, this upcoming election, we do not have to settle for one side of the aisle or the other. Like I said before, the Republican versus Democrat political divisiveness is just not working in the favor of our state. We have got to make sure that we can do something about that. Is it going to be easy to undo the political divisiveness that's been generated over the last number of years? No, it's not. It will not be easy. To even address our state's budgetary needs, that in itself will also not be easy at all. But the question is, can it be done? Well, I do believe that the answer is yes, based on all of these different examples that I have listed here before you today. Again, what I've shown you, this is not an end-all, be-all perfect solution towards resolving our state's financial deficits, or meeting our state's budgetary needs, or even increasing the fiscal strength of our state. But it can serve as a foundation for the direction that our legislature, working with the Treasurer's Office, can take to ultimately benefit Vermonters. So, with all of that said, wow, this has been quite the video, but I really can't thank you enough for the courtesy of your time. Let's make a change for our brave little state. Thank you so very much.